Our microphone's okay.
Okay, today is the 24th of March, 2015. Our topic is the American policy of the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and President Jimmy Carter. Both of them had the similar policy toward the Middle East. My guest is David DeWitt, reporter for the Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University, and this is Athens Speakout number 324. So in review about our last show, David DeWitt was critical of Kissinger and Kissinger's diplomacy, and he served for 7 long years from 1968 to 1975 as the chief diplomatic advisor to both Richard Nixon and his successor, Gerry Ford. And he served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, one of the few individuals who held both posts at one time, and that contributed to Kissinger's power. Now, David DeWitt made a good point that Kissinger was not a very good Democrat, and in particular, he overthrew the Allende regime in Chile, who was the elected president with democratic socialist leanings, and Kissinger was hostile to India and Bangladesh because he wanted to have good relations with Pakistan because he needed Pakistan's good officers in order to carry off this secret trip to Beijing, China. So Henry Kissinger was a wheeler and dealer behind the scenes for Richard Nixon's public success. And he was a very smart man. He wrote 18 books of both history and political science, and Kissinger understood how diplomacy worked better than any other Secretary of State since John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a professional diplomat for George Washington, his father John Adams, James Madison, the 4th president. He retired when Thomas Jefferson was president, temporarily to Harvard University, and then he returned to politics with James Madison and became the Secretary of State for President Monroe in the 5th president, and concluded the favorable peace for the United States, the Peace of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. And then John Quincy Adams was able to become the 6th president of the United States. And after his retirement with Andrew Jackson's victories, the idea of presidents having a good Secretary of State kind of fell by the wayside, and we've had no good Secretary of State until possibly the 25th president under Teddy Roosevelt, who had an imperial policy toward China, the Caribbean, and Cuba in particular. So that Teddy Roosevelt began to get back into the balance of power game, and Teddy Roosevelt's great contribution was the Peace of Portsmouth in 1905, in which he served as the mediator between the Russians and the Japanese in order to preserve a quick peace at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and that gave the United States security for the Philippines, which the United States was just beginning to get interested in the China market. Anyway, Woodrow Wilson had a little glimpse into the balance of power, because in his first term, 1914 to 1916, he wanted to keep the United States neutral from the European balance of power in World War I. But then, after he was re-elected in 1916, he changed his mind rather quickly and joined the Allied powers in 1917 and bailed the failing British and French armies and saved British and French democracy from the onslaught of the superior German army. Woodrow Wilson retired, and he tried to get an idealistic program known as the League of Nations, which would be a charter for international law. The United States was still basically isolationist, and the League of Nations was never ratified by the Republican Party, who remained dominant under Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, and the United States had no interest in foreign affairs until Roosevelt came to power, and Roosevelt then was his own Secretary of State. So we pointed out that the conflict between France and Germany between 1815 to 1914 was a century of peace, because Britain played the role as the balancer in the center and tilted the scales mostly in favor of the German powers, Austria and Prussia, and occasionally going over to the side of France in order to maintain the peace. So the Peace of Vienna in 1815 lasted. The four great powers ganged up against France and gave the four coalition powers the weight and tilted the balance of power and kept France isolated from 1815 to 1848. There was a brief opening in 1848 to about 1860 with the revolutions of 1848, in which the Habsburg monarchy and the Hohenzollern monarchy and the French monarchy were in confusion, and revolution broke out in 50 cities, but Otto von Bismarck became the Chancellor of Prussia and returned the balance of power in favor of Prussia and Germany, and Bismarck had an alliance with both Russia and Austria, and these three powers then were greater strength than France and kept France isolated until 1892. So that was the importance of understanding the balance of power, which Henry Kissinger grew up because he was born in Germany, and in 1923, and he knew how Germany and Austria dominated the continent of Europe between 1815 and the First World War. Germany was decisively defeated, and German democracy came into being. But then Adolf Hitler came to power, and as a Jew, his father brought Henry Kissinger to the Bronx, New York, when he was a teenager, and he went to high school in the Bronx and had a very modest ambition to become a public accountant. But World War II gave Henry Kissinger a new opportunity because he was a sergeant in the American Army. He became a citizen, and when the United States Army occupied Germany, Kissinger was hired as a translator and interviewed many of the top German officers and Nazis to see whether they were eligible to go on trial at Nuremberg. His colonel then told him, when you get out, you go to Harvard University and get a PhD in political science and history, and you will rise up in the United States rather rapidly, and that was a very valid prediction. So anyway, when Nixon was elected president, Henry Kissinger had experience with big oil, working for Standard Oil. He also had experience in Washington, writing 2 books on the use of nuclear power as a tactical instrument. So David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller put pressure on Nixon to make Kissinger his national security advisor, and Kissinger had the mission of bailing Johnson out of the lost cause in Vietnam and return the United States to a balance of power system in which the United States was in the center and Kissinger would have Beijing on one end of the scale and USSR on the other, and the United States could tilt the balance back and forth in order to preserve the peace without war. Okay, so I would like to ask a question of Dave DeWitt. Do you have anything to add to this quick summary of what we have been doing so far?
Well, our last two discussions, I've spent some time criticizing Henry Kissinger and what I perceive as his violations of human rights. But I do want to point out that I think that you're entirely correct that he brought a new, well, not a new tool, he brought an old tool,
right,
but an important tool,
right,
to the international scene,
right,
at least as opposed to what was going on,
right,
in the previous administrations,
right,
and that was to very shrewdly use power dynamics on the international scene.
That's right.
To put America in a good position,
right,
as far as that went, without the use of force, but through diplomacy.
That's
really.
Right.
So I do want to give credit where credit's due as far as that goes.
Well, I'm glad we've learned something.
Because the previous administrations believed in force, and they at least as far as
well, the previous,
and they didn't believe in opening or creating this wedge between Moscow and Beijing that he was able to create.
The problem with Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy is that they never took any history of the balance of power in school. And they came out of World War II with the conception, the United States is number one, Soviet Union is number two. Mm-hmm. And they had an ideological system known as anti-communism. Yeah. All you have to do is be anti-communist, and you can keep the balance of power number one for the United States on one end of the scale, and Russia will always, and Soviet Union will always be number two. There was no way the Soviets could catch up because they were weaker economically, weaker in ideology. Stalin was an old stale bureaucrat. Mm-hmm. But then they applied that Cold War ideology, anti-communist ideology, to the whole world. So Atchison got involved in Korea, resulted in a stalemate. Mm-hmm. Anti-communism became, as an ideology, even stronger, and the Republicans became even more fanatical on anti-communism. So then they said, well, when Kennedy came to power, you got to get into Vietnam. And it was Eisenhower who got into Vietnam through the anti-communist philosophy of John Foster Dulles.
Yeah, and Dulles believed in that.
And he believed...
Dulles believed in force, he believed in supporting...
There's a good and evil.
Yeah.
America good, Christianity good, capitalism good, communism bad. Well, Eisenhower then, when Dulles died in 1959, began to look at the military-industrial complex and gave a peace mission to Kennedy. He said, watch out for the future. This military-industrial complex is spending money on unneeded weapons. And then Kennedy started the peace program, the Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty, and Kissinger followed that up with another disarmament conference called the ABM Treaty in 1972, so that Kissinger was working on the nuclear front with the Soviet Union, and he was working with bringing China into the United Nations to be a balancer against the Soviet Union, and the United States could then tilt. That was Kissinger's program. Mm-hmm. So I think we've summarized the importance of Kissinger.
It's a tried and true old trick of politics on any stage to pit people against each other.
So,
in this case, countries.
Right. So now you're going to ask this new question. Explain how Henry Kissinger used the balance of power methodology in the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, which broke out in 1973. How does that work?
Between
or
Egypt
you want
and
me
Israel.
To explain that?
No, you can take that one.
Okay. Well, in 1970, Egypt was a ideological Muslim power, and General Gamal Nasser developed the idea of Arab socialism, and he was going to unite the Middle East behind this new ideology of Arab socialism and carry out a war of revenge against little tiny Israel. Well, Nasser died in 1970, kind of suddenly, and his vice president was General Anwar Sadat, who was much more of a modest general. And Kissinger convinced Anwar Sadat that the Soviet weapons that the Soviet Union delivered to Nasser were not as effective as American weapons. And he could point to the Arab-Israeli wars. The F-4 shot down the MiGs. So Kissinger says to Anwar Sadat, why don't you take American weapons and kick the Soviet advisors out? And then you'll have weapons that are just as good as Israel, and you'll at least be able to defend yourself against any further Israeli attack. Well, anyway, we have then the Fourth War, and Israel had won the Third War in 1967 with its smashing American technology, and they won it in General Moshe Dayan, doubled the size of Israel in 6 days. Well, Kissinger convinced Anwar that, yes, he better butter up the Americans a little bit for Egypt's survival. And then Kissinger was the rising diplomat, and Kissinger in 1973 was faced with the surprise attack, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, in which the Egyptians for the first time fired the first shot. And Anwar Sadat, with American weapons then, catch Israel asleep, and they want to get the Sinai back. So Sinai is Egyptian territory, and this had been an overreach on the part of the Israelis in 1967. So Anwar Sadat makes the first shot, and then it was a 22-day war, and Israel lost the first week, and then Israel regains its territory in the next 2 weeks. And after those 22 days, both sides defeated themselves because they burned up all of the American tanks and all of the American weapons. And now Kissinger becomes the mediator. Yes, you sign a peace, you sign a ceasefire, and Israel, you're going to have to get out of the Sinai. And you're going to have to admit that Sinai is Egyptian territory. And you're going to have to withdraw those Israeli settlements and even the Israeli oil wells, which you seized illegally in a war of aggression, and go back to the territory of Israel as of 1967. Well, that was a long, long procedure. It took 7 or 8 years for that proposal to go through, and Egypt and Israel finally signed in 1978 a peace agreement in which Israel recognizes Egypt as a nation state, and Egypt recognizes Israel as a nation state, and Egypt then is detached from the Arab League and abandons Iraq and Syria that still had grievances with Israel. Mm-hmm. So that's the successful peace that Kissinger pulled off by having a monopoly of the resupply. And that peace was financed by the American taxpayer. They gave $6 billion a year to Israel to replace its equipment, and they gave $3 billion to Egypt. And both Egypt and Israel have been on the American payroll ever since, just to keep the border between Israel and Sinai stable. And of course, it's been a cold peace. The Egyptians sometimes infiltrate Arabs through the tunnel, and there's been no great investments on the part of Israel. A few rich Jews go to Egypt for a cheap vacation, and that's about it. I think that's more or less my conclusion on the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. You have any questions about this? Comments or additions to make?
No, just well, I guess that was the 70.
The 73 War, the Yom Kippur War.
Okay, yeah, okay.
And it was called the Yom Kippur War because that's a religious holiday among Jews.
Right.
It's called the Day of Atonement. And supposedly the Egyptians were resting. And the Day of Atonement is like an annual Mass if you're a Catholic. The Catholics are supposed to say Mass once a week when they're a teenager. But the Jews have a 1 day of atonement in which they meet with their relatives and very close friends and admit all of their sins over the year.
Oh.
That's the theory of the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
It's a real day of rest, a real day of religious thinking. The word holiday, it was originally holy day.
Of course.
But there's been a decline in religion.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, not Saddam Hussein, but Menachem Begin, who was in charge of Israel at that time, took religion very seriously, and Anwar Sadat took religion very seriously. So I'd like to go over the military balance there. When the war began, the Israelis had 375 to 400,000 troops. That was against the Egyptian army, which was larger, 650,000 to 800,000. So the Egyptians have land power on their side. The Israelis had 1,700 tanks. The Egyptians had practically the same number, 1,700 tanks. And the armored vehicles, Egypt was way ahead with 2,000 of them. The Israelis only needed 3,000. Oh no, the Israelis were ahead, 3,000 to 240,000 for the Egyptians. And armored units, artillery units, they were just about equal. 945 artillery units for Israel, 1,000 artillery units for Egypt. Aircraft, just about equal. 440 combat aircraft for Israel, 400 aircraft for Egypt. Now, in terms of deaths, when the war was all over, the Israelis lost 2,500 to 2,800 men. The Israelis suffered much more, 5,000 to 15,000. Aircraft, the Israelis lost from 100 to 387 aircraft, depending upon your statistics, and the Egyptians lost 341 compared to 514, much heavier losses in the air. Well, anyway, they're all replaced to a parity level by the American taxpayer in order to keep the peace going. I think I've given you the statistics on the... now, there was a big if in this ceasefire. If Israel withdraws from the Sinai, and Israel says, yes, we'll withdraw the Sinai, but rather slowly, in stages. And they held that off to resettle their oil wells and resettle their civilians. And that lasted for 7 or 8 years. And it wasn't until Carter came to power in which the final peace treaty was signed. But Carter then followed, and Ford Ford follows the Kissinger strategy, and Carter follows the Kissinger all the way to 1978. And this was carried out, this truce was carried out, or this final treaty was carried out at Camp David by Carter being the mediator between Begin and Sadat. And Sadat finally agrees, says, I'm going to make a surprise visit to the Knesset, and I'm going to recognize Israel. That was a storm of publicity. And then the treaty was signed a year later, and Begin had to retreat from territory, much to his chagrin. Now
those the Camp David Accords.
The Camp David Accords
Right.
was the peace treaty,
Right.
and Carter signed it. Carter was the mediator, but Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat got the credit in the Nobel Peace Prize. And there was a little bit of a snub at Kissinger on the part of anti-Carter thinking among
Oh, I see.
the Jewish establishment.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of a balance of power. Egypt on one end, Israel on the other in 1972, with Israel holding the predominant force, the United States being in the middle. It's slightly changed by 1978 in the Camp David Accord. The United States is tilting toward Egypt, or Egypt is tilting toward the center, toward the United States, and only Syria and Iraq and the Arab League are left out on the high end of the balance, and Israel is still predominant. And so the balance of power is basically tilted in favor of Israel, but the people on the end are a little bit separated.
Now, wasn't Sadat eventually assassinated
He was assassinated by a fanatic.
people who disagreed with these
Fanatic
accords?
Muslims who said, well, you sold out the Palestinians, you sold out the Iraqis, you sold out Nasser's Arab socialism. We got to continue. You put Egyptian national interests ahead of the Arab cause.
Right.
So Egypt has been a kind of a back to the old historical Egypt.
Yeah. In your opinion, does Egypt remain there? Are these consequences
Yeah,
reverberating
Egypt is still
today?
a power.
Yeah.
Egypt is still getting the subsidy. The Arab Spring didn't amount to much. The Arab Spring was a kind of a shaking of Mubarak, and they had elections, but the elections didn't prove much. Now they have a new dictator by the name of Sisi, and they're still holding the Egyptian Arab Brotherhood in limbo, and hopefully there won't be an outbreak of another assassination.
Yeah.
But Sisi still needs American weapons.
Right.
The Arab Spring was a good publicity stunt for the Egyptian democratic forces, but the Coptic Church, the Christian Church, about 10% of the population, are still on the fringe, so to speak. And the Muslims have all of the power.
Right.
The only question is, what are they going to do in this new Obama administration, which vacillates?
Right. Yeah, we haven't seen anything.
Well, they talk about fighting ISIS, and supposedly Egypt is supposed to be fighting the Iraqis and the Syrians.
Right.
And they've sent a few airplanes. But this war is up to Obama to de-escalate or expand.
Well, it's brought some strange bedfellows.
Well, that's the balance of power. And Obama really didn't understand the balance of power. He was
You don't think so?
No, he was interested in becoming the first black president. So
Yeah, he wanted to be president, but what do you think is... I don't see a tremendous change
between him and Bush.
in his foreign policy,
No.
no.
No, he just said Bush.
Maybe scale, you could argue. Instead of
well,
troops on the ground, he has a preference for
He
drone
cut
usage.
down he cut down the number of casualties. The number of casualties were heavier under George W. Bush. And he said, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. And we're going to withdraw from Iraq.
Right, so that's boots on the ground.
Yeah, as soon as he takes
But
them
as
out.
far as conflict goes, he's
well-
been just as confrontational. He
Yeah,
uses
yeah,
the
yeah.
drones and he uses
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, okay, yeah.
selected bombings.
Yeah, yeah, he's still caught between American Zionist friends and his election, and his re-election.
Yeah.
And Kerry is doing the same thing. We have
Let's take a station break.
We got to take a station break here. We're talking with David DeWitt, and we're talking about how Kissinger was even-handed in keeping China and Soviet Union at peace, and was even-handed in nuclear disarmament talks, and was a little bit even-handed in the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1973, in which he separated Egypt from the Arab League, and that weakens the Arab power for a while. But I forgot to mention that the Egyptians had on their side not only Iraq and Egypt temporarily, I mean Iraq and Syria temporarily, they had the new OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum
yes.
Countries.
And they exercised their
And
power very
They put on an
immediately.
embargo, and they proved to the
Yes.
American people, you're going to suffer consequences in the next war. You got to be careful in this blank check to Israel.
with the oil embargo
Right.
that led to
Right.
gas prices and
Yeah.
lines at the gas
Right,
station
right.
extending blocks long.
Yeah, you got that. Well, I guess we're just about up to 19.
Well, I did think one thing that was interesting about the recent situation with the re-election of Bibi Netanyahu and his vacillation before the election, where he hinted that he wouldn't support a two-state solution, and then when he was re-elected, he immediately about-faced and said, "Oh no, we still support the two-state solution."
Well, he's only interested
In
in
theory,
one thing, the money.
but the Obama, well, of course.
He'll say anything.
But I thought it was interesting that the Obama administration, when he was threatening that, immediately pivoted to the UN and started saying, well, we might just go back to supporting the 1968 boundaries and
That's
the
right,
lines
right.
there.
And you see what the Palestinians want. They want a recognition as a state by the UN General Assembly.
Right, yeah.
And the British, the French, the Germans, all the Europeans, only the United States vetoes that.
Right, yeah.
So-
It's almost universally supported throughout the world.
Right. So now, the strange character is John Boehner from the state of Ohio.
Westchester, Ohio, yes.
Why did
Our
he
Speaker of
invite?
the House.
Why does he invite?
Why?
Why does he invite the Israeli to speak to the American Congress over the objection of the president? What is he dealing? Do you think he's a Jew?
No.
Is he a closet Catholic?
What?
Who is he for?
I think he's for undermining the Obama administration at any turn.
At any
every
cost.
turn, at any cost.
What is he
And
really
in this
believe?
case, the cost was an undermining of the entire structure of U.S. diplomacy.
He doesn't know anything about
extending
diplomacy.
back forever.
Yeah,
I mean, this is unprecedented, right?
Unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented.
Yeah, it is a very serious violation of, and there's this has been rehashed in all the talk shows and everything in our political conversation, but it really undermines the president's ability or the faith of our allies and enemies in the president's ability to conduct foreign policy.
Right. Oh, I think Netanyahu has lost ground among American Jews.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Because he went so hard
Right.
before the election.
Right. So I think Netanyahu is, well, he won the election.
He did end up winning. It was a nail biter, but he did end up winning.
Yeah, but what's he going to do until Obama retires? That's the unknown ball game.
Right. Right. I don't think he's going to scale
In
back
other words-
settlements anytime soon.
Well, no, he's not going to. He doesn't have to move the settlements. But the big problem is what happens to Iran. Will Obama carry through and make a nuclear agreement with Iran? Because
I think he
Netanyahu-
should. I think he should try to.
So do I. I'm for America and peace.
Yeah, me too.
So we have no disagreement on that. Well, anyway, to follow up on the fifth Arab-Israeli war, since 1977, there was no big outbreak of war until the fifth Arab-Israeli war, when Israel attacks Lebanon in 1982. And from 1982 to 85, we have Begin, the big hawk, the big things, decides to go to war against the PLO. The PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the Soviet Union then subsidized Arafat to recruit terrorists to keep the pot boiling in Iraq and Syria and throughout the Arab world. And Menachem Begin thought he could nip Palestinian Liberation Organization in the bud. Yeah, they invaded Lebanon. They bring Lebanon into it. But Yasser Arafat retreats to Tunis. And then he comes back. So Menachem Begin's war solved nothing.
Yeah.
Except give Israel bad publicity in the United States. And I heard other Americans denounce Begin. Now, before Begin and before Netanyahu, no American ever made any peep against Ben-Gurion or any of the early victories in the first 2, 3, or 4 wars. First 3 wars, anyway. Israel was part of the Jewish, American, Christian, one civilization, one humanity. Yeah, well, that's
basically
coming apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's coming apart.
Decades of war can do that.
So, in conclusion, then, about Henry Kissinger's, before going on to the Bush-Cheney administration, is that Snowden and Greenwald, in attacking George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, have brought the Middle East question up to the front again by showing that the CIA and the DIA and the NRA since 2000 have been collecting all of this intelligence from the Middle East and from all American citizens, but they are not very effective in preserving the peace. What are they doing with all of this intelligence? They don't have enough people to analyze it and understand it. That's the big failure of, and so it's, I think that the New York Times and the Washington Post, CBS and ABC and so forth have hired new dovish journalists who see that Zionism is less credible. That's what I think the importance of all of this is.
I think Zionism has become less and less credible
Right.
in most people's eyes. But I'm not sure that Bush or Cheney were ever very much interested in peace in the Middle East.
No, they were interested in the oil.
Yeah, right. Yeah, natural resources.
Right. And they made excuses that they were going into...
Peace was never a priority.
No.
Democracy, even less so. But
That's
that's
right.
what they talked about
That's
a lot.
right. But the excuse of invading Baghdad was, we're looking for weapons of mass destruction. And they were hoping to get some pro-Zionists to vote for them
Yeah.
in these elections. Well, most Jews are liberals. Most Jews are loyal to the United States first. And they are embarrassed by this Israeli propaganda.
Yeah. And the CIA documents were just released this past week,
Right.
in which the Bush-Cheney administration built their case. And
Right.
although we already knew what a shaky case that was, they just exposed it as being even more shaky.
Right. So anyway, we can go now to another question. You can ask me this question, but then the next question is...
Question 2,
What did Jimmy... Well, we'll finish with Kissinger.
Okay.
What did Jimmy Carter try and do about the Arab-Israeli problem in his 4 years? And how well did he mediate the problem?
Well, we already talked about the Camp David Accords.
Yeah, that was a conclusion that was set by Carter, and Carter then carried that out. Mm-hmm. And they eventually got out of the Sinai. But it brings up the question of the UN General Assembly resolution of 242. You know anything about that?
I've heard of it. Was that vetoed by the United States?
Well, this is when Moshe Dayan won his big victory.
Okay.
Now, the British drafted this resolution, 242, and it went to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And it said, well, Israel is clearly the aggressor, and Israel is supposed to get out and supposed to retreat back to the 1967 line. Mm-hmm. This is so-called Green Line, okay? But there was a little escape clause in, and it was signed with a little American-Israeli escape clause, provided Israel has secure borders. So then there's all of this debate, are the borders secure when you still have the PLO and various terrorists infiltrating, okay? So the 242 resolution would like to be enforced by the Arab world, and the British would like to at least discuss it again. But the big problem is the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. Gaza Strip is Egyptian territory, and the Israelis have just rounded up all of the Palestinians and dumped them in there. So there are 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza in an open-air concentration camp.
And it's also separated by, what, 60 miles or more from the West Bank?
Yeah,
there's two different territories there.
Yeah, right.
And a big gap.
Well, no, not exactly. If you look at the map, you have the Sinai, which is separate. And you got the Suez Canal, and you got the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea separates the Negev and the desert, okay? But there is a land bridge then along the Mediterranean coast.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yeah.
So the Palestinians were originally called Philistines in the Bible.
Right, yeah.
And the Philistines become the tribe that inherited that territory. And when the Hebrews came out of the land of Egypt, they went up past that to Jerusalem, and then they were always fighting the Philistines.
I see.
Well, the Philistines disappeared into the deserts, and they were intermarried, and we don't know the Philistine language. It's just a tribal language. But the name of the land was understood by the Persians and the Chaldeans and the Greeks. They said, okay, this is the land of Palestine.
I see, yeah.
And it became a province in the Turkish Empire.
Okay.
But there is a land bridge between the shoreline, because the canal was an artificial thing. And the Red Sea goes up to a point, and there's a land bridge there. Okay. Well, anyway, this became a dumping ground. Well, Egypt doesn't particularly want that territory back.
No.
So it became a United Nations displaced persons camp.
Yeah, like a refugee
And they had this
camp,
thing called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Administration. And the United States and the British and America kept giving them subsidies in order to feed them, okay? So every time there's this war, the Israelis just put a blockade there. And then the terrorists use some missiles. This is Hezbollah and Hamas and the jihads. They got missiles, and the civilians who live in Palestine are just victims. I mean, in the Gaza Strip are just victims.
Yeah.
So this last war, this 2014 war, is another black mark on Israel. They killed another 2,100 casualties. And they got a ceasefire with American pressure
Right.
and with British pressure, and by the threat of, well, if you don't stop, we're going to recognize you. So that's the big, and boycotts.
Yeah.
Companies are saying, well, we're going to divest.
Right.
There was a little
Hand 'em in the
incident here in
pocket.
Ohio University.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The blood bucket challenge.
Yeah. So that's the problem with the Gaza Strip. Okay. So in terms of statistics, then, there are 1.8 million Gazans. 1.8 million Gazans, refugees in Gaza. Then there is another 2 million Muslims living in the West Bank, and then 4.2 million Palestinians, 4.5 million Palestinians. Now, compare that with the Jews, 6 million Jews in Israel. 75% of the territory in the 1948 borders have been settled by Jews, and the Palestinians are unrecognized peoples. That's the two-state solution. And Israel is absolutely opposed at this time to any second state. So there are 5.4 million to 6 million Jews living in the United States. That's 1 or 2% of the people of the United States. So who are the Jews? Is it a religion, a race? Is it a culture? And do American citizens define democracy by its Constitution? And that's going to be the problem of the future. That's where it is. But under Carter now, from 1976 to 1980, this was still somewhat in the future a little bit. And Jimmy Carter tried to follow John Kennedy's principle of democracy and atomic test ban treaties, and wanted another treaty of disarmament with the Soviet Union. And he wanted to follow up the ABM treaty of Richard Nixon. And he believed, as a Christian, that he should have a duty to bring peace between Muslims and Jews, and he was going to be the great peacemaker, had great ambitions. But these hopes seemed to work up until 1978. And Kissinger then, Carter had two advisors. His first advisor was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor. And then he divided the national security advisor with the Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. So Cyrus Vance was the dove who wanted peace and wanted Carter's program of mediation. And Brzezinski was somewhat of an ideologue. You know much about Zbigniew Brzezinski?
Well, I know that he was a counselor to Lyndon Johnson before later being named National Security Advisor to Carter. I know that he's fairly hawkish.
Very hawkish compared to Carter.
Yes, yeah.
Right. And even compared to Kissinger.
Yeah.
Why is he hawkish? Where does he get that attitude?
What were his motivations for being hawkish? Well, that's a good question. Maybe you could shed some more light on that. I don't know what the man's motivations.
Zbigniew Brzezinski is a Polish aristocrat. He
Okay.
was born in Poland, but came to Canada and the United States when he was a teenager, or kid, actually. And he got his BA education at the University of Toronto, and then he went to Columbia University. But his father was a diplomat by the name of Brzezinski, and he served the old pre-war 1939 Polish government.
Oh.
So in 1945,
Well, yeah, when
in
you see your
1945, when Poland became a communist captive state,
Yeah.
Brzezinski Sr. came to Canada and became a Canadian citizen. And Brzezinski then gradually migrated and became Americanized and Canadianized and came to Columbia and majored in anti-communist studies
Yeah.
and became a political scientist and not a diplomatic historian, and had a hard line against not only communism, but Russians. He has a Polish tilt against Russians
Sure.
and
yeah.
a Catholic tilt against communism.
Well, with his Polish heritage and seeing what happened to Poland,
That's
first
his-
by Germany and then
that's
by
his-
Russia.
Now, Carter wants to be protected from his rear by bringing in Brzezinski, because he knew the Hawks would come out and say, well, you know, too much détente, too much collaboration with China, and okay, I have Brzezinski. So he had Vance, Cyrus Vance as the dove, détente, and Brzezinski he's somewhat for détente, balance of power, but go slow. He's saying you can put pressure on the Soviet Union to liberate the captive nations. We can put pressure and have more independence for Poland. We can push that to Hungary, to Romania, to the whole 6, 7 captive nations, and the Soviet Union will be forced to retreat. So Kissinger is balanced between a hardliner, Zubrinski, and a soft Vance,
And Cyrus Vance.
Cyrus Vance.
Yeah.
That's now he was.
Now-
Carter is charged.
What
as
about
a Pisa-
Carter? Who was
as
he
a-
pulled by more?
Well, Carter was charged with a Pisa by the hardline anti-communists, by the Republicans, and by some Democratic Zionist types. So Carter begins to lose Jewish votes. 90% of the Jews voted 90% for Franklin Roosevelt. Only 80% in 1968 for Hubert Humphrey. And when Carter ran in 1960, he got 60% of the Jewish vote. So he was only a one-term president. Because from
Right.
the
Well,
Zionist point of view, from the Jewish hardline anti-communist point of view, he's too soft on communism. That's who Brzezinski is.
yeah. He was meant to be the hawk to give Carter credibility with the other hawks,
That's true. That's
but it
true.
didn't seem to work.
Well, it worked up until 1978,
I see. Okay.
and Carter was losing some ground, but he was still viable in 1978. Now, in 1979, he faces 2 new crises.
Yeah.
The
The
Iranian
oil.
Revolution, the Shiite Revolution, and Afghanistan. Now, the oil is a problem as far as his domestic. Carter was blamed for inflation. Well, this was a Republican thing to say, well, under Carter, the inflation was 21%, so forth and so on. But Carter had no control over the oil prices.
Right. That was OPEC. Yeah.
That was, OPEC collaborates with the banks.
Right.
And Carter then, and Ford were under the same thing. They inherited the debts of Richard Nixon. Well, we have to stop now.
Yeah, you got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, we want to summarize, and we're talking about the role of Zubrinski and his differences with Cyrus Vance, and eventually it goes against Carter for his reelection.
Right.
What is your conclusion?
Well, I think that our main focus today has been a lot about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think right now we're in an unfortunate situation where the Israelis just reelected a hardliner on their side. The Palestinians are currently represented by hardliners.
That's right.
In the form of Hamas. And I think that most of the world supports a two-state solution. I support a two-state solution. And I think that we will need to see them elect both more moderates to represent them if we're ever going to get there.
Okay.
That's where I'm at right now.
Well, that's very good. I agree with your political philosophy, and we have a little more work on Jimmy Carter's failing 2 years,
Yes.
1979, 1980, and the Iranian Revolution, which went against Carter, unforeseen.
Mm-hmm.
And why did the United States CIA ever get into Afghanistan? What were they trying to do in Afghanistan? And who financed that?
We'll have to explore that next time.
That's what we have still on the table. Well, we'll have to stop at this point.
Well, thank you for having me, Professor.
This is a debate that has to continue. My slogan is, keep the debate going. Debate is the oxygen of democracy.
That's right. Thank you so much.